Okay, so I want to start tonight with just a little snapshot of what's happening in New Zealand. So we know that 90% of our teens are on social media, so use is almost universal. We know that the average amount of time that a teen spends on social media is 2.5 hours a day, but actually almost a third of our kids are spending 5+ hours a day on there, so most of their spare time. But at the same time, we know that 39%, so almost 4 out of 10, wish that social media had never been invented. So this is telling an interesting story, not of one of kids who are really happy to be on these platforms, but kids who are kind of chained to them. They have to be on them. And then finally, we also know that about 50% of New Zealand teens say that they wish they hadn't been given social media so young. So when your kid is begging you for social media, keep this in mind because they may not actually thank you for it later. And this is kind of one of my biggest concerns, is that this generation of kids, when they reach their mid-20s or so, they might really ask us why we gave them access to social media when by this time we knew about all the harms. So this is very important because social media has been linked with a whole host of negative outcomes very consistently in research, and it's becoming more and more so. So things like depression and anxiety, eating disorders, issues with body image, cognitive issues, so problems with attention, poor sleep, and also physical health outcomes like headaches and things like that. So you'll hear more about that tonight from experts in those areas. But now I just want to touch on this very specific type of social media use, and that's problematic use. This is really important because this use mirrors addiction, and it's been very strongly linked with things like anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And our research in New Zealand shows that 22% of our teenagers meet the criteria for problematic use. And when we reanalyzed the data and just looked at females, that increased to 25%. So a quarter of our teen girls. So how does social media cause how is it linked to all these outcomes? I'm not going to go through them all, and this is probably not an exhaustive list, but it's just to highlight that it's not just about predators and content and algorithms. And actually, some of these things are negative outcomes, but at the same time, they drive engagement. So just taking loneliness, we know that kids who spend a lot of time on social media have increased loneliness, but also lonely kids turn to social media and engage with it more and more. Now, we're talking about social media tonight, but just to keep in mind that a lot of these things also apply to other platforms like Roblox and YouTube Kids. And then we need to add in this extra layer of complexity, and that is the teen brain. So those mechanisms that I just talked about before, they're kind of important for all of us, but we do know that teens are more vulnerable to them. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of things as to why that is. So the first is this mismatch in the brain. So during the teen years, there is an explosion of development in the limbic system, or the emotional part of the brain. And an easy way to think of that is kind of like the accelerator in the car. And then the prefrontal cortex, which deals with things like problem solving and decision making, that's just kind of developing on a relatively linear trajectory. And that is kind of, if you think of it as the brakes in the car. So there's this mismatch where their teen brain is a lot of accelerator and not a lot of brakes. Now the thing is that when a kid is on social media, we also know that it really lights up the limbic system. And what we really want happening in the teen years is our kids engaging in activities that really activate the prefrontal cortex. Now, we also know that teens have a heightened sensitivity to social rewards, and they're also at the peak risk-taking period of their lives. Now, this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because this is the time when our kids are meant to be going a little bit, moving away from home a little bit and meeting new people. And that involves taking some risks, but also being able to read social cues. only social media kind of exploits this with social rewards, so things like likes and shares and comments. And then the final thing is that we also know that the reward system in their brain is in overdrive. So that part of the brain has more dopamine receptors than the adult brain. So Anna Lembke, she is a researcher in America. She is an expert in addictions, and she talks about this, about how social media and other screens are highly rewarding but low effort activities. So in normal life, dopamine's there to make us do some hard work. We get a little hit of dopamine, we find it rewarding, and we're motivated to do that activity again. So that's things like studying for a test, or making new friends, or doing physical activity. Only when we're on social media, we get that reward with very little effort. In fact, you can just get it from receiving a notification. And what the brain then does, or what people think is happening, is then the brain kind of tries to reach a new homeostasis. And in order to do that, dopamine levels dip below baseline briefly. And so we feel like that is a craving and a low mood. So ideally, what we want happening in the adolescent years is our kids not getting this highly rewarding, low effort activity, engaging in that. We want them engaging in activities that make them work for their dopamine up front. So what do we do? I want to talk about the current solutions and why they're not enough. So first of all, filters and safe phones. Filters are very important, and I recommend that everybody has filters on their devices. I'm not saying that, but to keep in mind that it's mainly about content and they're not 100% effective, but also a lot of things that are harmful to our kids are never going to be picked up by a filter. So for example, I don't want my 12-year-old daughter watching videos of 13-year-old girls who are spending an hour or 2 hours in the morning doing their beauty routines. That's not harmful content, but it will probably be harmful. Also, safe phones, anything that connects to the internet, kids can find workarounds, and that is just a Google search away. So I think better name for that might be safer phones. Digital literacy, a lot of people are like, well, we just need to teach our kids to use this stuff better and teach them. The problem with that is that digital literacy is a prefrontal cortex skill. So our kids can learn this stuff. You can give them a test and they'll perform well in it. But then when they're on social media, that part of their brain kind of shuts down, and it's the limbic system that's working. And so all that learning kind of goes out the window. And that's why we have research that shows that digital literacy programs increase skills, but that doesn't result in improvements in well-being outcomes. Another one is to teach our kids to be good digital citizens. I would argue that we need to teach our kids to be good citizens, good people, and then that will translate into the online world when they're ready. Parental monitoring, again, is super important, but there is lots of disappearing content. You can't keep up on this stuff, and also you can't be sitting over your kid's shoulder all day while they're on social media. Other people will also say that we need to put kids on these platforms in order to build their resilience. Now, some of the stuff that our kids are seeing is so horrific that if they're not negatively impacted by that, I wouldn't call that resilience, I would call that desensitization, and that is not ideal development. And then finally, contracts. I have a couple of issues with contracts. First of all, they don't work. So our parents didn't get us to sign a contract to say we weren't going to smoke or drink alcohol when we were young, because they knew that that wouldn't work. Also, our kids will sign anything in order to get social media. So there is a level of coercion in there. And I just don't think we should be making the parent-child relationship transactional. Also, as I said, we need to be addressing all these things, and those things don't address all these things. So any solution should do its best to kind of target as many of these things as possible. So I've worked in this space for many years, and for quite a few years, I suggested that the solution was digital balance. Only digital balance didn't work, because I can't teach your children to stay safe in an unsafe environment. And that is because there's nothing I can tell you to tell your kids that's going to stop them from finding this really rewarding, from activating the limbic system. What I think the real answer is delaying until their brains are ready for it, until they've reached until they're mature enough to handle these platforms. Now, the problem with this is that a lot of the activities that we know that build the prefrontal cortex, they are being displaced by social media. And so that is one of the reasons why I say delay for as long as possible. Now, I don't think this is all about taking things away from our kids. In fact, my solution is more about what we give back to our kids. And we need to give back to our kids all the activities and the things that social media has eroded away from their lives. And those are the things that build the prefrontal cortex. So things like real-world relationships. So our kids need to hang out in person with their friends, but we also need to remember that research shows they actually only need about 2 to 5 friends. They don't need 500 online friends, and in fact, that is overwhelming to their brains. But when I'm talking about real-world relationships, I also mean their relationship with us, because a lot of parents feel like they need to step out of their kids' lives in the teenage years, but that's really often when we need to step in. And unfortunately, social media is a barrier between the parent-child relationship. We also want our children to be capable adults. So we want them to have life skills, to know how to make their bed every morning and put their clothes out at night, and to be able to make food and things like that. I also recommend that you create spaces for what I call emotional playgrounds. That's from Gordon Neufield's work, but it's basically places where our kids can go to process their emotions, and that can be journaling, listening to music, playing sport, just anywhere where they can have time to have their own thoughts without other people's thoughts kind of bombarding them. Time outdoors is hugely healing. Also, their identity formation is also really important. And so when they're on social media, they're just always receiving content from other people. But what we need for true identity formation is to go out into the world and then to come back and have time to talk with our friends and our families and just to process it. And then all the other activities we know that are really good for brain development. So sleep, as I said before, listening to music, but also just a lot of downtime, because our kids don't have downtime anymore, and it is so important for their development. And I would say just prioritizing any activity where they have to work for their dopamine up front. So tonight we are talking about what parents can do, but of course, as Cecilia said, this isn't really a parenting problem, and we need change at all levels. So Australia brought in age restrictions recently, and there's a lot of stuff in the media that this isn't working. These companies aren't playing ball at the moment. They're behaving very badly. But I do want to say that the latest statistics that I've seen is about 30 to 40% of kids who are underage have been kicked off these platforms. In public health, that is a massive success. You know, people talk about it just being a blunt tool, but it is a very successful blunt tool if we can implement something this, pretty much overnight, and it has this sort of impact. And I just want to finish by saying that just because social media use in young people is a social norm currently, it doesn't make it healthy, and it also doesn't mean that it can't change. Thank you.